Hi there, Graham from Penguin Motors here. Today is the start of a new video series. In this series I'm going to do a strip down and rebuild on a 4-cylinder Rover P6 engine. Now, there are a few unusual aspects to this engine. Most notably is the oil pump is not only external, it's halfway up the engine. The production oil pressure for these is incredibly high. I think the rated pressure is something like 80 to 100 psi. But frequently we find these have all got rattly bottom ends. So all that oil pressure and still the bottom ends rattle, well, to be honest, I don't think the oil pump's location helps. And it exits the pump via a pipe which is actually missing off this engine. It exits via a pipe that goes from the oil pump to the main galleries, or if the car's got an oil cooler, out of here, all the way to the oil cooler and back again. Tortuous route for the oil, which means they often take a long while to build oil pressure on startup, hence the fact that a lot of these rattle on startup. So if you've got one that winds over for a while before it fires up, that's probably not a bad thing. Other unusual aspect while we're looking at this side of the engine is this plate. It's cast iron block, but there's a huge hole in both sides that they cover this end plate. This engine is incredibly heavy for what it is. Whether the big plate was weight saving or something else, I do not know. But it's quite curious because when you take it off, it exposes the internal cores of the bores. With a conventional flywheel around the back. Nothing too unusual around the front. And I'll just move you around so we can look at the carburetors. Single carburetors would have either had an HS6 or an HIF44, which is just the metric equivalent, with an integral float bowl. Twin carbs. The 2000s used enormous HD8s, 2-inch carbs. I'm not exactly sure why they fitted such big carbs. There's various rumours on the internet. From a performance perspective, 109 horsepower, it really doesn't need such big carbs. And the twin carb engines also had a tubular exhaust manifold. Going back to carburetors for the moment, the later 2.2s had twin 1.75" HIF44s, which is probably still a bit overkill when you think it's the same size carburetors are on a V8. Now, one interesting point to note here is you cannot convert a single carb engine to a twin carb. Well, a lie, you can, but you need to change the head, because on a single carb, the carburetor mounting is cast as part of the head with a top cover. There is no separate intake manifold. So if you want to convert a single carb to twin carb, you've got a major engineering exercise, or you've got to find a twin carb head with the associated manifold and the throttle linkage. It's not easy. If you're looking to buy a twin carb car, buy a twin carb car. Don't buy a single carb and try to convert. Carburetors removed, we can clearly see the tubular manifold and the intake ports on the head. They're round, straight down and angular, and I'll just pop you in an image of a single carb so you can see just how different the single carb engine is. Here I've put the engine TDC number 1, just to make my life easier for reference. I just want to see where the distributor points to number 1. You can see it's top to center. Looking at the cam lobes. Now, of interest is this bracket here, because in order to remove the camshaft, you don't want the timing chains snatching back the sprocket. So that's what this here bracket is, similar to as fitted to TR7 Dolomite 1850 and Triumph Stag engine. You've got this plate in here that you can pull over, put a nut on, and therefore retain the sprocket and remove the cam. But you don't do it at TDC, because for a start you can't get the two bolts out. So I'm now going to turn the engine over to where Rover time it up. For valve timing, Rover departed from the norm. Valve timing is set with number 1 exhaust valve fully open. And they handily gave us a little locking tool. If we were to loosen off these little air bolts, with number 1 valve fully open, we can loosen those bolts, pick that little plate up, and if we've got the engine in the right place, this little key will slide across. You may have to rock the engine slightly to get it on there. So that's the camshaft position. Now this sprocket's clevered because it's got an internal tooth, so you can actually put it anywhere you like. But we've locked that up there. If you look around the front, we could now actually push the plate over, put our nut on it, and still remove our bolts, so we get the sprocket off. So we go around to the back of the engine. With the engine in its normal mode of direction, that pointer there will line up with either the 104 mark or the 108 mark, depending whether it's single or twin carburetor. In this case, it's considerably before the 104, so clearly this has been debated, and the camshaft is not time correct. It's opening the valves far too early, or whoever last had it in bits had the engine rotated slightly the wrong direction when taking the slack out the chain, because if I rotate the engine backwards, it actually lines up 104. But rotated in the correct direction of travel, the camshaft is timed in too early. Right, to obviously further my earlier point about the oil pump being so high up the engine, the oil filter is inverted, which can only help the oil drain back, and therefore you've got to, after a long period of standing, you've got a very large, very empty oil filter that takes a long while to fill up with oil. Can't help but think they should have used a filter with a dip tube, or as well as a non-return valve that doesn't fully seal, or at least found a way to put the filter that way up. And here you've got a little pipe off the oil pump which feeds pressurised oil to the top timing chain tensioner. Simply attached with a couple of banjos and some copper washers on a common cause for oil leaks. Access to the top chain tensioner is via this plug, which literally just prizes out. It does, honest. There we go. Just held on a rubber O-ring. And in the hole, we've got access to the upper tensioner. Right, on the side of the engine is a little cover. If we remove the cover, inside we'll find a bolt that we can unscrew. And although I don't show it in this video, try not to lose the bolt down the inside the engine. But once we've taken the bolt out, theoretically inside we can poke a little Allen key in there and use that to retract the chain tensioner. So, having extracted the tensioner through the hole, you can see where the chain is sawn grooves in the tensioner pad. Because I've put a nut on the pin or took the bolts out, we can then lever the chain back off the camshaft and the chain will stay put. We can now undo the bolts that hold the head down and lift the head off. Right, I've took the small head bolts out around the front of the head. I'm going to release the head bolts. I'm going to gently crack them off little by little. And the load a bit by lifting the camshaft up first. Buckets will probably stay behind. Yep. It's not really relevant, but I'm going to, at this stage, but I'm going to put the buckets back where they came. And now, with a little bit of gentle prying, very gentle in fact, you should be able to lift the head off. There we go. What we can see, I'm staining now, his head gasket was leaking and I can see some rust water staining in number 1 piston. Feeling with finger here, we've got some truly massive steps in the bore where the rings cease to travel when they're up down movement. So, where are we now? Well, nothing too major. I've took the water pump off, simple unbolt job, crank pulley, simple job, 1.5" AF socket on a crank pulley. And I've also prized out all the plugs in the front cover to give access to the lower tensioner, the bolts that hold the guides in, and the bolt holding the sprocket on the end of the auxiliary shaft. I mean, in some respects, this engine's quite ahead of its time because to give access to the timing chain via bungs held in the block with only a rubber nylon seal, whatever, is a modern thing to do. There's quite a lot of modern engines like it. Yeah, and like I say, there's nothing holding these in other than the springiness of the O-ring. But whereas modern engines don't leak, these seem to. But clever idea. The only step further they take with modern engines is they make the front of the crank removal so you can remove the whole chain assembly out the top. So, if I was doing this by the book or in the car, and I'm doing neither, I'd probably crack the auxiliary shaft bolt off, but also I'd wind back the lower tensioner to stop it trying to grab the chain when the oil pump's removed. But I can't do that because the sump's still on. But again, if you was in the car, you'd have the sump off, because to change the lower chain, what you have to do is remove the upper, remove the bolt there, tensioner out, and you drop the chain down, and with the oil seal removed, you can hook it over the crank pulley and remove it out the bottom. But I'm not really, so by doing what I'm going to do now, once I've removed the auxiliary shaft, the lower chain tensioner is going to ratchet out, but it really doesn't matter because we're going to take it all to bits anyway, and it's just convenient to take the oil pump off now while the sump's still on. So what I'm going to do next is technically the wrong order, but it really doesn't matter. So let's crack that auxiliary shaft pulley off. Find the right socket. So with that bolt removed, we should be able to go around the side, remove the oil pump, and then that intermediate auxiliary sprocket assembly, lift the top chain out, and I say, we'll worry about the bottom one later. So, side cover off, and it's relatively clean in there, but that's because these side covers have already been replaced. And I tell you what, in the car, that is not an easy job. In fact, as I alluded to earlier, you can actually see straight through the engine. There we go, cast aluminium sump. And as I said earlier, very unusually given the age of the engine, no sump gasket, just sealant. There you go, that's how you take the bottom chain off. Just disassemble most of the engine, pull the front seal off, Bob's your uncle. And there's the bottom tensioner pad, which is pretty well worn. Right, let's look at a few big end shells. I'd be surprised if they're not on a copper. I've only seen the bottom end of one engine that hasn't been. Shells stay attached to the crank, which is never a great sign. Got a lot of dirt and grit embedded in it. The bearing shell itself, there's a strip of copper there and a lot of dirt and grit embedded in it. It's a Vanderbilt, original type lead copper, got a Rover part number on it. So the crank's never been ground. That's only one. Let's look at the other engine. Same again, a lot of grit. More signs of copper, but ooh, that journal's pretty rough. Same again, a lot of scoring. And the shell's not a great fit in a rod. Yep, like the others, standard size still. Right, let's lift the mains off. Right, it's actually 6:30 Sunday evening. I'm going to do one last thing before I pack it in for the night, because I'm due back here in about 12 hours. Got this far, might as well just knock the pistons out. We know the bores are worn, but it needs a rebore, so... Oh! Well, that one had a broken ring, so broken ring and the bore wear will account for the relatively low compressions this had. Another piston with a broken ring. Three pistons with broken rings. Can we make it a full house? Yes, we can. Yep. Top ring on this one's broken as well. And these are incredibly heavy piston rod combinations. I'd estimate these at least double the weight of a V8 one. Looking at the sheer bulk and the mass of it, you've got to think that perhaps they intended a diesel variant of this engine. So here we've got the cylinder head sitting in my degreaser, and I'm just going to do a quick check for valve sealing. Not really necessary because I'm going to pull it apart anyway, but it's always an interesting look. So all we're going to do, we're going to use a degreaser and fill the ports with degreasing fluid. Can't find a switch, but you could use water, petrol, any kind of thin fluid. If the valves are seating well, they will hold the fluid. Let's just do the inlets. So remarkably, given the poor condition of most of this head, the valves are starting at the ceiling reasonably well. Although, if you look here, I'll zoom you in a bit. We can see that this inlet valve is leaking, and so is this one. But it's not pouring through, so in actual fact the valves are doing a half decent job of sealing, but we're going to take it apart and strip it anyway, but I thought it'd be worthwhile look up front just to see. Alright, so next I'm just going to pop the valves out. Oh, stuck on the collet. Well, that's well stuck, this one. That's got it. Gonna give the valve a quick wiggle, feel for play. Yeah, that guy's quite good. Very, very thin edge to the valve there. There's not a lot of material to them, but that's quite sunken now. Here's a new one. They're quite thin anyway, even when new. So those of you not familiar with P6 engines would think they don't have a valve guide seal. Well, they do, but unusually it sits inside a groove in the valve guide. And incredibly fiddly to get out. Let's try this one. There we go. The remnants of P6 valve stem seal. Needless to say, they don't do a great deal. So, with the cylinder head checked, with the cylinder head stripped, let's just pop a valve in a bore and check for guide wear. I don't know if the camera picks that up, there's a fair bit there, but there's more in that direction than there is in that direction, which is fairly typical because of the action of the cam. So clearly we need to look into that. So that's it for the disassembly. Our 4-cylinder P6 engine's all in bits. Obviously the next video in the series we're going to start putting it back together, but I may bring you a performance potential. I mean, other than twin carbs, Rover never developed anything of a performance variation of this engine. Mainly a little demand really. They didn't put it in any more sporty models, and they had the V8, so there was little point. But if you take a deeper look at it, I think the engine could have been made to give quite a considerably more power output than it actually did. But anyway, that's the story for another video. And if you like this, you know what to do, guys. Like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Helps me bring you more videos. Catch you on the flip side.